Let's talk about the game object. There are already two game objects in here. There's the main camera. This is a game object. And there's the directional light. This is another game object. These are two game objects. But I'm going to make an empty game object. This game object pull down lets you build various things like cubes, spheres, capsules, sprites, particle systems, lights, audio, video players, UIs, lots of different things. But I'm going to make an empty game object. And let me name it empty. Now, all game objects have a component called the transform. And this is the transform of my empty game object here. And what the transform represents is the object's position in world space, which here is at 0 in the X direction, 3 in the Y direction, and 0 in the Z direction. Unity is a left-handed coordinate system, X, Y, and Z, which is left-handed. You'll notice that the game objects that were already here, the light, it had a transform as well. It has position, rotation, and scale, but it also has another component, a light. And so with this empty game object, I can add a component to it, either by searching through them here or by pulling this down and adding a component. I want rendering. I'm going to make it a light, so I'll add a light component to it. And this empty game object now is a point light. The other light is a directional light. This is a light that all goes in one direction, whereas my point light is light that emanates out from a point in a sphere. And of course, there are various parameters here that we set, things like the range, how far the light goes, what its color is, various other things, intensity, other stuff. We'll talk all about that later. And once you have a component on something, you can remove it. So components are not permanent. You can take them off. This is now back to being an empty game object. So we can add components, and we'll talk about all the different components as we go along here. One thing, let me make another little game object here. This time I'll make a cube. I'm going to put it back at the origin. So by resetting it, this moves it to 0, 0, 0 with a 0, 0, 0 rotation and a scale that's 1 by 1 by 1. That actually is a cube that is 1 meter square in Unity world units. Now, you can focus on objects by clicking on them in the hierarchy. We'll talk about the hierarchy in a bit. Or you can select it and do a Shift F, and it will then focus on that object. Shift F stands for focus, and it brings us in to view our object. Let me bring another little game object in here, a plane, and the plane is at 0, 0, 0, so I'll move my cube up so it stands a little bit above that plane. And I can focus on the plane, or I can focus on the cube. And you notice it's kind of a smart focus in that it frames it so that you can see the whole thing and see the whole cube or see the whole plane. I mentioned the manual. The manual is accessed from the help menu. The help menu up here We can access the Unity manual, which opens a web browser, uh, a web browser that notice is on my computer. This is a file, not an HTTP. And this is the user manual. It has lots of different stuff like how to install Unity. Doesn't make sense. You wouldn't know how to install it unless you'd already installed it. Lots of things about the user interface. Here's documentation on the project window that we just discussed. And there's also a scripting reference. This has all the information about the Unity API. So you remember I mentioned the component, the transform. Transform. Uh, as with anything, you have to spell things right. Transform. So this looks up the transform for me. It has all the different properties of the transform, the various methods that it has access to, things like functions and rotate and translate, transform, translate. These are all functions that we'll use to manipulate our world when we get to scripting. The manual, the scripting API also has sample code showing you how to do things with transforms. So for instance, if I'm interested in the Euler angle of the transform, that's the rotation. Here's a sample piece of code that shows you how to manipulate the Euler angles. And this code can be cut and pasted into one of your own scripts, and you can try it out right away. So the manual is really quite good in that it has everything in it, and it is searchable, and it has links that go on to other components that it thinks might be relevant to things like quaternions, mono behaviors, get key down. All of these are links to other places in the manual. And this is all on your computer when you install Unity, although there is a web version of it at the Unity site too that you can also access. Um, there are subtle differences between 217, 218, and 219, and maybe 220. Uh, but so using the one that goes with your installation is probably a good idea, although the homework assignments may go to a generic one at the Unity site. So we've looked a little bit at the scene view when we were playing with these different objects over here that we made, and the scene view is where we build our world. We can zoom in and out. We can rotate around. We can pan back and forth, and so this lets us kind of move around in our world and look at different places by clicking to look at the plane, or clicking to look at the cube, or clicking to look at that empty thing, or clicking to look at the light or the main camera. All of these things we can fiddle around with and move. As I mentioned, that the F key focuses. Uh, and this all works when you have the hand tool selected. There are a bunch of different tools here that do different things, but the hand tool is the one that lets you kind of move around in your world. If you have the select on, instead we're going to be moving the object around. So these tools do different things. And there are shortcuts here. The Q key goes to the hand, the W key goes to the translate, E rotates, R scales, And we'll get to these other things later. But very quickly, Q, W, E, R are the switch among these different tools rather than just pointing and clicking, which does exactly the same thing. The left mouse button or the arrow keys will let you pan around in your world. The right mouse button orbits. An interesting thing is the right mouse button with WAS and D keys, which then lets you turn into an airplane. So right mouse button, uh, right mouse button, and now I'm flying around in the world. This is not zooming, this is kind of flying. So once you've built a big world and you want to fly around in it, you don't have to set up an airplane. You can just do it within the scene view, which can be very handy. Of course, if you have a scroll wheel, that zooms in and out. I highly recommend a 3-button mouse with Unity. Using a trackpad can be a real pain. So in the scene view, there are gizmos that appear. So for instance, if I focus now on the cube and I switch to the W or translate, I'm seeing this gizmo that lets me move my object around, and it has the X, Y, and Z axes corresponding to red, green, blue. RGB is X, Y, and Z. If you look closely, you'll see there's a little square here that is kind of embedded in the 3 planes, the XY plane, the XZ plane, and the YZ plane. And this lets you move the object around within that plane, uh, uh, but only within that plane. It's constrained not to move out of the plane. So we can move around. We can also move things around by kind of grabbing this window, putting that over the X and pressing the left mouse button and moving it, or I can just type numbers in here, type 0 and 2, 0. I can type numbers in there and it has the same effect. The rotate, so this is pressing the E key or hitting this little rotate. And we have these little rotate circles that rotate about X, Y, and Z. And so I can rotate my object by grabbing it there, or I can rotate my object by selecting over the X, pressing the left mouse button and moving it around, or typing a particular number in here, and it sets to that orientation. The scale works kind of exactly the same way. Let me reset this back here and move it up to so the scale, again, has the gizmo that lets me scale it here in the Z direction. So notice over here the Z is being scaled, or in the Y, or in the X direction. And I don't know what it means, but you can make negative scales. I'm not sure that does things appropriately. And of course, you can type numbers in here as well. So there I've set it back to 111. There is, with both the translate and rotate, there are local and global axes. So here I am in global. And let me rotate this guy a little bit so that we can see the difference between global and local. So in global, the gizmo is in the world X, Y, and Z. If I'm in local, the gizmo is in the objects X, Y, and Z. Objects have their own local coordinate system. Uh, we think of the local coordinate system as X to the right, Y up, and forward in the Z direction. RGB is right, up, and forward. And we'll use this a lot in scripting when we want to move our object in its forward direction. We have various handles for doing that without having to think about how things are going. There's another gizmo here. This kind of shows you standard views. It lets you kind of rotate around the object, look at it from above, look at it from below. And it also lets you change from a perspective view. Let me back up a bit. Change from a perspective view to an orthographic view. And in an orthographic view, there is no foreshortening. So this here now, parallel lines are parallel, which is not realistic, but it can be helpful when you're trying to lay things out. And this is the perspective view, which now has this foreshortening where things further away are smaller. So things look more realistic. And we almost always use the perspective view, particularly in gameplay, although things like overhead maps might be more easily read if they're in orthographic view. So we will see this again. Local and global, whether the translation and rotation is about the global XYZ world coordinates or about the item's local coordinates right up and forward. There's also a pivot center. We'll talk about that later. And one thing that's kind of interesting is we can also look at this in wireframe. So it's a little hard to see in wireframe, but here now we're seeing the various vertices and triangles of which our object is made. And we can also do a shaded wireframe that shows the different triangles that our objects are made up of, as well as the shading. And there are a whole bunch of different views here too that we'll talk about later when we get to lighting. There are, we can turn lighting off. We can change whether the skybox is visible, whether fog is in effect, if there are lens flares, various other effects can be turned on and off here. So I can turn off the skybox, which is this blue sky that we're seeing in the background here. If I had fog, I could turn it off, light flares, particle systems. These things can be turned off in the scene view. Doesn't affect the game view. And we can turn off the light here so that we just see things in its unlit state. The gizmos that we've seen here, for instance, we saw a light that had a gizmo on it that was a light. And we saw a camera over here that's had a gizmo on it that showed as a camera. And we can change the size of those gizmos to make them less obtrusive or to make them stand out even more. So now the camera gizmo has gotten real small, and you don't really see it until you're right up on top of it. Let me make it default size again. So these are the gizmos that let us know where the different objects are in our view, even if they don't have a cube attached to them. This has a cube, so we can see it.